So when we talk about wrestling in the West, and you hear about Greek wrestling, you see, the statues and the rest, urns and things like that. You see images in Greek art about wrestling. It was part of the ancient pentathlon. It was a standalone event. Wrestling, yes, they used to also wrestle naked, right? As they competed in all the events. Certain parts could get grabbed that, again, are generally frowned upon today. But wrestling throughout history in a lot of cultures is not just the pins and leverage holds that we have today, but also included a lot more like locks, and it was a little more violent, right? You could more submissions and things like that we would consider more like jiu-jitsu based today or whatever, but more traditionally in catch as catch can or ancient Greek wrestling or whatever. That was still a relevant part of what they did as well. If you were an ancient Greek wrestler, you won the Olympics. Kind of the same things we talk about in terms of professionalism in sports today, which arguably kind of goes, against some of the Budo ethics that we talk about in martial arts, how martial arts can help us as better people. A lot of that is very similar to ideas of amateur sport, right? It's not how you win or lose, it's how you play the game. Ideas of teamwork, sportsmanship, and those are things that we emphasize in our martial arts classes too, right? So those things, other sports certainly can teach you some of those viable things or whatever. But when you get into professional sports, where winning is the more important thing, and there's money involved usually and stuff like that, and then you get the ringers, and sometimes you get the prima donna athletes, and you excuse some of those other things for performance, right? And it's not then the line goes from, instead of, it's not whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game, to winning isn't the only thing, or winning isn't everything, it's the only thing, or whatever, right? So you have that shift. That's not too uncommon from the ancient times, right, where you had, if you won the Olympics, then you would probably, you would become famous in your hometown or your home province, right? You would be a superstar. You might have a gymnasium nailed, which they would practice in this place called a palestra. Carmel has a palestra now, right? It's where they get the term, but it's not exactly, I don't think they have guys wrestling naked there, but they do have a palestra. But again, you might have a statue built in front of you, just like Peyton Manning does, or whatever. You might have in front of it, you might have again, the place named after you, just like John Wooden does, or whatever else. You might have you would presumably, some of the richer people in the area, right, you would be set for life because of them or whatever else and stuff like that, right? So it was very much still a professional thing. Now, some of the things we talked about also, the difference between martial arts and martial sports still applied back then too. Admittedly, it was much more rugged, brutal, compared to modern standards or whatever, but there was still a debate even in ancient Greece as to whether wrestling was really actually relative to, was it really pertinent to war, or was really a distraction? Like the Spartans really kind of boycotted, and I haven't found I found a secondary source for this. I I hadn't found a very authentic original source on this, but the Spartans supposedly boycotted the Greek games when they outlawed like eye gouging, right? They're like, this is getting soft, this is stupid, right? And then the other thing is like, no, this is not how we fight war. You don't go one-on-one and wrestle with the guy. You're in the phalanx. You have a shield in the back of the guy in front of you. You are all pushing forward together. Young men shouldn't be wrestling. They should be in a phalanx trying to push a tree over. Because that's how you train for war. This is a distraction. Right? So the debate between martial sport and martial arts is not a new debate. Right? That same debate raged in the ancient world. Okay? But still, wrestling from then, for a long time has always been considered kind of a part of the curriculum or whatever of, young men in particular to learn fighting spirit and all those other things, right? The things we say that, again, martial arts can teach us, okay? As I mentioned, it was a practice in the Palestra, but the Palestra was not only just a place of wrestling, it was considered much more of an area of mental and physical education, okay? You wrestled in a sand pit. There was music that was present. There was, baths and things like that. Like Plato, Aristotle, some of your famous Greek philosophers would do a lot of their philosophizing at a palestra, right? So this was a place people would congregate and share ideas and things like that. Again, music was played there. This was it was where you went to wrestle, right? But this was, again, it was more than just a training gym, okay? Again, you had the baths or whatever else and stuff like that. Of course, lots of places had, kind of altars to Greek mythology and stuff like that there, right? So Carmel's Palestra is probably hearkening to some of those other activities. Like I said, not necessarily the wrestling. I haven't seen, it'd be cool if they came full circle and had wrestling matches there, right? But probably more just the concerts and stuff like that, okay? Now, jump ahead a little bit, we go to catch-as-catch-can wrestling, okay? Catch-as-catch-can wrestling is a more modern one that we say really kind of developed in Lancashire, England. It was popular at the turn of the 1900s, okay, and it had leg takedowns like freestyle, but it also had submissions and chokes. It was very much kind of like the Western version of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, okay? And this is in the, the amusement hall era of, so again, turn of the 1900s, right, you would have people that would, yes?
What is that after the age?
Sorry, yeah. Catch as, can. In other words, you catch as you catch. You get a hold of them any way you can. Catch as catch can. Okay? But this was when professional wrestling in the West was really actually pretty legit professional athletics. Okay? Not the professional wrestling that we see today on television. Okay? And so you would have, this is really, in my opinion, one of my more interesting parts, kind of the heyday golden era of, again, more the Western wrestling in particular. There are famous, Frank Gotch is the famous American champion. There's Zbyszko, who's a Pole, there's Hankin Schmidt, there are all these famous, and you know, there were lots of world champions or whatever, but there were these famous wrestlers that would then tour. Gotch, and I can't remember who he fought. I think it was Nabisco. Like, fought at Wrigley Field. And the gate for that, you know, they didn't have pay-per-view back then, there were televisions, but the gate was millions of dollars. Like, it would still be one of the, like, you know, highest grossing events today, you know, inflation adjusted, right? For the money back in the day, the amount of money that was paid to see these two guys wrestle, and it filled Wrigley Stadium, right? Wrigley Field, not Wrigley Stadium was in England. It was at Wrigley Field in Chicago, right? And again, it was a huge event, okay? But you would have these champions, they would tour from different cities, and there might be a headline match, but then, you know, you couldn't hop on a plane and get there in a day and then leave, right? So you made it to another city, you were going to stay for a long time. So this is where, you know, again, you had your amusement hall, you had your theater, whatever they would do. Often there would be some strongman feats, there would be some other acts or whatever that went along with it. But then a lot of times they would take on all kind of comers, challengers, right? Anybody that could beat them will win a sum of money that was, you know, $10 or whatever. But back then that was a ton of money or whatever it might be and stuff. And, you know, so then they would take on the amateur ones. Now, you know, so the idea then again is if, you know, you beat everybody, if you beat all the local guys that are considered good in the first night in like 5 minutes, well, I've got 2 more weeks in this town before we move on. I've got to make money here. What are we gonna do for the rest of the time? You know, so you know this is when, oh well, maybe I'll let him win. So then we have to have another match tomorrow night, right? And make it best out of 3. And oh well, they just happen to win. One guy wins, so now I'm guaranteed to get a packed house on the 3rd night to see who wins the championship, right? And so this is the start of that. That was the start of that slippery slope that led us to professional wrestling that we have today. Okay? I'm not bursting anybody's bubble when I say that professional wrestling is not real today. You know that. Okay, just making sure. Okay, so, but yes, so that gets us gets us in that slippery slope, where they are legitimate athletes, but they're trying to make money. They develop the personas, and you still see that in fights today, like in boxing or MMA. Some people take the bad guy role, some guys take the good guy role, right? It's about how do you sell the fight, right? People either like you or hate you, but they want to see. So either way, they buy. They either want to see you win or they want to see you get your face caved in. But either way, they pay for it, right? So you're selling the fight, right? If you're a boring but good fighter, it's tough to get a headline event and get a big payday because, you know, again, you don't sell anything, right? If no one really feels about you one way or another, right? So, you know, so there is that element, the theatrics that start working its way into what was very legitimate wrestling. It's also to know, I bring up like Shanghai and that time period and stuff. This is the type of wrestling that, like for example, they would have jiu-jitsu versus catch-as-catch-can matches, right? So, and usually it was, they because the Western powers were more in charge, most of them would not wrestle in a gi. It would be more just in like, you know, your wrestling, you know, shorts or whatever. And so without having the gi grips and everything else, someone who specializes in basically, you know, that type of wrestling had an advantage. If they were putting the jackets on and they used, you know, could choke with the gis and stuff like that, then usually the jiu-jitsu guys did a lot better, right? But, so there were some matches held but again, because they were very similar. There was a lot of the same types of joint locks and chokes and things like that. But this is the catch-as-catch-can era, okay? One of the others that is worth one of the other wrestling styles that's worth noting is Indian wrestling from India, not Native American, from across the country India. Okay, it has been a national sport of India for centuries. Epic heroes and kings supposedly have practiced it for centuries. Wrestling matches to the death used to be used to settle disputes, just like duels in Europe, right? You offended my honor or whatever else, we'll pistols at Don Hamilton or whatever things, right? Or fencing matches in Europe, right? Used to be wrestling matches to the death, yes.
Isn't it called a duel? Like,
Yes, in the West it's a duel, yes, right? Of course, it suffered during British occupation. Like elsewhere we talked about, you tend not to let people do what they did. It has deeply religious connections, okay? They practiced in an akara. What's, I think, interesting to note, that's an A, okay? A-K-H-A-R-A. What's worth interesting to note is the similarities between a palestra and an akara, okay? The akara was a holy site. It was run by a guru. It takes place on you have a earthen colored pit, colored red. It had a well of sacred water. It had shrines. It was, again, it had shrine to athletic gods or whatever. So it had, again, it was much more of a cultural place. Okay, so there's a lot of, it was kind of in the same, again, a little more, kind of similar to a palestra there. What's unique about, or what is special about Indian wrestling is some of their supplemental training exercises. They were famous for a ton of gymnastics or other types of calisthenics, somersaults and headstands and all these other things to condition the body, right? As part of their wrestling routine. They would do thousands of repetitions and stuff like that. Massage was also an important part of the daily routine, okay? And they would use a ton of like maces or basically weights and weighted clubs and things like that to swing like around their shoulders, develop strength in their shoulders or stuff or whatever. And the reason I point that out is it's kind of interesting how so often fitness fads today really aren't necessarily the newest and greatest things, right? And it's often repackaged. So, now for a while, kettlebells have been a big, kettlebell workouts are a big deal at the gyms, and a million different types of kettlebell workouts, and they're at the Y, they're at wherever you go, everybody's got kettlebells to swing and stuff, and there's these routines, and that was cutting edge from Russia originally or whatever else. Well, it's just, Indian wrestlers 2,000 years ago had basically kettlebells or weighted clubs or these other things they would swing. If you ask, particularly in America, what is kind of a given nowadays, that basically weight training for athletic performance, right, that you weight train in the off season to get stronger, in particular, very specifically for your sport, right? So it's a lot of times a very sport-specific weight training program, but it's a given that you want to get stronger and faster or whatever for your sport. You do that on the side or whatever, right? And in the West, that's credited a lot of times to the NFL as the first to do that or whatever else. But again, Indian wrestling figured that out thousands of years ago. Karate, carrying big jars to get weighted jars to get grip, so their grip would be stronger for grabs and things like that. They did similar things. Okay, isometric contractions. Okay, where basically I tense two sides of the muscle against one another. Right, so I don't use weight. I use my own muscles against one another to develop. We call it isometric contraction. Okay. In the West, we credit isometric contractions from NASA, okay? Because they were worried about how, when astronauts first went to space, they're like, well, they don't know how your muscles are going to react to that, how much they're going to atrophy, right? So are they going to be are you going to basically be a blob of jello when you come back? Like, how fast do your muscles, basically degrade in zero gravity? Because you don't have any, like, you can't lift working out in space, right? In zero gravity isn't a big deal, right? So how are you going to, how long does it take for, well, so they developed these isometric contractions so the astronauts could work against themselves so they wouldn't lose muscle tone while they're in space. That was the idea, right? But you see these karate forms, right? These strong chungo, like in demo, that we're doing right here. Isometric contraction, hundreds of years ago. And so maybe they didn't, right? Maybe these countries or these different arts didn't have necessarily the science behind it to describe. They knew what was up. They knew how to train the body. They knew different ways and what worked and what didn't and everything else, right? So it just goes to show there's nothing new under the sun sometimes. Yes?
What does that say?
Akara. Akhara. Right? It's the wrestling in India. Okay? All right. So, one guy in Indian wrestling I know is a guy by the name of Gama. He, one of the more famous Indian wrestlers. When I did my Shanghai study, I keep talking about, he made the papers when he wrestled in India, he made the papers in Shanghai. Now that's not so unusual given that I was reading British papers. Why would that be not so unusual to have Gama noted in the British papers? Because who controlled India at the time? England, Britain controlled. It was part of the crown, okay, at the time. So this is again before Gandhi. So, though he was kind of small, only 5'7", 200 pounds, he never lost. Defeated some of the best of the American European wrestlers. He beat Zabisco, who I mentioned before, one of the Polish champions. He beat him like something like 6 seconds, right? So he was quite a famous wrestler. Again, he made international news when he wrestled or whatever else. Became a national hero of India. The split between Pakistan and India, I'm not really sure on the details on what happened, but basically kind of got caught up in that. Basically died in abject poverty, emaciated and everything else because of that split, but was again very famous there for a while in that. Okay? All right, now switching back to some of the more Asian styles, we're going to look at judo and talk a little bit more specifically about judo today. Okay? Judo means the gentle way. It was founded in 1882 by Jigoro Kano. Jigorokano. And Kano studied jiu-jitsu. Remember we said jutsu art came from, right? Judo came from some jutsu arts, okay? Kano changed the term jiu-jitsu to judo, made it more of a do form, but it's more than just it was more of a hybrid style of several different schools or systems of jiu-jitsu. And he adapted, or kind of what Kano was really good at was identifying kind of the core. I really like how Kano thinks. Like, I think his brain and my brain were kind of similar, right? But I'm not saying I'm on par with him, but he makes like I kind of really appreciate what he did. But he was really good at basically breaking down principles, like in these different schools of judo, seeing how certain things were very similar and kind of boiling down the essence of all that they all had in common to make his judo. Okay. Originally, it was just considered another style of jitsu. Kano's school, they did a challenge match, and early on, like his schools were not really. Other styles were beaten him pretty handily, but then he challenged his school called the Kodokan, challenged kind of the largest, most prestigious jiu-jitsu school in Japan, the one that like all the police and the military trained in and things like that. He challenged him to a series of matches, and they won. Judo won something like 13 out of the 15 matches, like tying them. Okay. So overwhelming, convincing victory, okay? So that then judo exploded as the new thing, right? Part of that is his development of randori, okay, which we will talk more about through practice in a minute, okay? But Kano was quite an innovator in a lot of ways. He was more of a Western educator, or he was an educator. He was familiar with more of the Western style of things. He was actually a member of the International Olympic Committee. In fact, he died coming back from America. He died on a ship coming back from America after meeting with the IOC and different things like that. So he traveled the world expounding on the virtues of judo and demonstrating judo and things like that. Okay? He also is credited with developing the ranking system that we use in the martial arts today. Okay? So prior to this, there are other types of certificates or diplomas of various ranks, Minkyo, license. You hear titles thrown around like Shihan or things like that suggest various levels of certification as a martial arts teacher. And so, and they might be very specific. Like your diploma might literally say you're qualified to teach, up to orange belt, but no further. Or you can teach these forms, but nothing else, right? So they could even be very specific diplomas or whatever else, right? But the belt system that we have today really was not a thing. Kano developed the belt system. Okay? Now, usually, nowadays, if we're not too familiar with the system, in Japanese it's called the Q system, in Korean it's the GUP system. It's really the goop system, but no one says it that way, so it's the GUP system, right? But in Japanese it's Q. Nowadays you start at 10th Q, that is your first rank. You go down the Q, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The rank right before black belt is first Q or GUP, okay? And then you go from the color belts or the Q system to the Dan systems, which are the degrees of black belt. And you go up the dans from first dan or first degree up to, in Korean martial arts we stop at 9, Japanese martial arts usually go to 10, and originally it went all the way to 12, although really that doesn't happen very much anymore, okay? So this, and when we have our go nights, when we have our game nights, we talk about this, right? For a couple of things, this Dan system, you can get Dan rank in things other than martial arts. You can get Dan rank in flower arrangement. It's a very traditional art form in Japan, or tea ceremony, okay? You can get Dan rank in the game of Go, which is a strategy game that had a lot of tie to the martial arts as well. The Q system was a handicap system in the game of Go, based on like how good you were, you had rank, like the amount of difference between the players in skill, then the weaker player got extra stones to put on the board, right? So this is a way to handicap a game between two different levels of skill in the game of Go. He took the concept of the Q system and put it into the martial arts. Originally, there were only two colors of belts. There was white and then there was black, okay? There were no color, there was not the rainbow colored system. We actually also owe that concept also to judo, but not from Kano, one of his students, who went to Paris, was actually a judo master in Paris, teaching in Paris, basically realized a long time ago that Westerners need a few more carrots along the way, right? So he came up with his rainbow of colors to give along the way to distinguish between. Now, then a little while longer, then they did start doing like white, and then they added red to separate like the lower Q from the higher Q, and then you had the black black belts as well, okay? So the modern ranking system that we talk about belts today really comes from judo. And again, the belt colors are added after the fact. And there might be, when people make their own rainbow of colors for their belt system, they might put some symbolism in it, right? So sometimes you'll hear green is for growth and blue is for reaching to the sky as you know, are growing in the martial arts, or you're reaching you're heightening up or whatever. Red is for danger or whatever, right? So again, people maybe put symbolism behind whatever belts they have in the martial arts, but this is all after the fact, right? There's no, this is what they want them to symbolize and stuff like that. There's no tradition with that or whatever. There's also an oral legend. It's completely wrong. This is not how it went, but you will hear this repeated often that, see, the reason black belts are so good is originally you couldn't wash your belts off, right? You never could wash. Sometimes you'll even hear, if you wash your belt, you wash away all your knowledge, right? So you can't wash your belts. So everybody started as a white belt, right? And then you got thrown to the ground a couple times, because keep in mind you're practicing in someone's backyard or whatever. You got thrown to the ground a couple times, you got up, got a little dirty, got a little dusty, started getting yellow.